Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Monday, April 29th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Akron game in 124 days, the game against Michigan in 215 days, the 2024 NFL Draft now safely in the rearview mirror. Some interesting takeaways from that draft for both Ohio State and Michigan, and not necessarily the takeaways we thought we were going to have, because both teams felt like they had fewer people drafted than expected. So what does that mean for this year's Ohio State-Michigan game? Well, we're going to be talking about that today with our buddy Tony Gerdeman of BuckeyeHuddle.com. Tony, I think maybe one of the more surprising things to me was only 4 Buckeyes picked in the draft. That is the smallest Ohio State NFL draft class since 2013. Marvin Harrison and Mike Hall went early. Cade Stover, Tommy Eichenberg kind of went middle rounds. And then there were a whole bunch of guys that we thought, hey, maybe Steele Chambers, maybe Josh Proctor, maybe Matt Jones, guys like that, Xavier Johnson. You might see them picked. Nope, none of them. Just the four guys. So when you hear smallest Ohio State NFL draft class since 2013, what's your big takeaway from that?
My big takeaway is generally what happens soon after a small draft class. And I always think back to the 1998 Ohio State draft class, which consisted of nobody. And then you had the 1998 team, which was, built on some older guys, some guys coming into their own. The best team in the nation that year got upset by Michigan State, of course, but was number one for most of that year. And they didn't have anybody drafted the year before. It's because they were still building that talent and just a little bit too young. This team, however, like Ohio State, this is built on I'd say 8 guys legitimately saying no to the NFL draft and returning for senior seasons. So I think that's the major reason why the numbers were low. And then you look at the guys that didn't get drafted. Josh Proctor, injury history, a 6th-year guy. That's not always a great thing when the NFL is looking at it. Same for Matt Jones, had some foot injuries, and a 6th-year guy, Xavier Johnson, just a walk-on. I think a former walk-on, so there's going to be a little stigma there. I also think that he's a guy that can stick and do so many different things. So I think it's probably best for him that he got to choose which team he went to in a sense. But yeah, the top 4 guys went as expected. And then it was always like, well, could one of these guys, could Steele Chambers, could somebody take a flyer on an athlete, that sort of thing. Josh Proctor had a fantastic 6th-year senior season. Would that translate? And, when you're picking in the 7th round or sometime, maybe that's more potential than anything else. And some guys pick just based on, what, that guy has been in college for a while and it's a quicker transition to the NFL, but just too many question marks on the guys that didn't get picked.
And when you look back at some of the previous years where there were not a lot of guys picked, 2003 for Ohio State, coming off that national championship team, they only had 5 guys picked. And then the next year had an enormous draft class. I think it was 14 the year after that. So one of the biggest draft classes in Ohio State history. So that does tend to be, you've got some younger talent who's not yet draft eligible or has chosen not to enter the draft. I just feel like this year's Ohio State team going to have some talent on it. But it is interesting to me that you see multi-year starters not getting drafted. And that's I'm not sure what exactly that says. Maybe it does feel like that traces back a little bit to recruiting where, you had Steele Chambers as a multi-year starter at linebacker, but they had to move him over from running back. And you had guys where just it felt like a lot of other guys didn't pan out, and that's how you ended up with, hey, you've got to shift a guy from running back to linebacker, and they also had a guy shift from linebacker to running back and train him. So they've had some misses in recruiting, but nowhere has that been more true than at safety. You had a really interesting post on the huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com about Ohio State's safety recruiting, and I'm just going to ask everyone at home to just think in your head, who was the last safety drafted from Ohio State? I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. Tony, let people know who it was. And boy, that feels like that's been a minute since that player was a Buckeye.
It has been a minute. That was Jordan Fuller, who I believe was the 2020 draft, was drafted in the 6th round with the 199th pick overall, which is also when Tom Brady was drafted. So they share that in common. But yeah, the last safety drafted before Jordan Fuller was Malik Hooker in the 2017 draft. So 7 drafts, 1 safety selected, and that is probably worth a study in terms of like what positions have done worse at Ohio State than safety, because you don't have to go too far back. You can go back to the 2020 season when they're starting Marcus Hooker, Marcus Williamson, Jocelyn Wint is part of that. Like some names that should have been recruited over by that point, but they had to rely on. Lathan Ransom as a true freshman was playing. Bryson Shaw the year after that and year after that, where it's you've got guys that it's surprising that they were starting at that point for Ohio State, and kind of saw the results the past few years in that secondary until they finally got things shored up, and certainly have things set up pretty well this year as well. And that, I believe Lathan Ransom gets drafted next year, so that will finally start to slow some of that down. And of course, Caleb Downs will get drafted probably the year after that. But really just poor recruiting, poor development. And some would say, you look at the coaches at that point, at that position, and you can see why.
Now on to Michigan, and there's the old saying that joy or results are the results minus expectations is like how you're feeling. And Michigan's draft, they had 13 players drafted, one of the biggest draft classes in history. And it still felt kind of disappointing based on some of the expectations that got thrown out there, where Jim Harbaugh is talking about 20 guys. He thinks they could have 20 guys drafted this year. And they had 18 guys invited to the combine and then had 13 guys drafted. And that's a big class. But 4 of those guys were drafted in the 7th round. So you have 9. Now it's 9 guys in the top 6 rounds. And it felt like a little bit of a, kind of a flat ending with all the guys they had going out there. And, we've seen undrafted guys make teams before, and I'm sure some of them will make teams. And so it's, this is by no means trying to disparage Michigan or this draft class or anything like that. It felt like for a team that had those kind of expectations thrown out there by their own coach, this was not just some random guy. This is their head coach saying this is what he was expecting to be possibly true. It just felt like, boy, I didn't hear Michigan players getting called nearly as much as I expected to, especially earlier in the draft.
Yeah. The 20 number thrown out by Jim Harbaugh was almost backed up by the 18 players invited to the combine. But you never saw that in terms of like, who are these 18? Who are these 20 players that are going to be drafted? Who are these guys that are going to have 5 more draft picks than the record of 15 by Georgia set in 2022? So I never really saw that. And I always assumed that a lot of these draft picks were going to be in later rounds. Now they did have 7 guys taken in the first 2 days, the first 3 rounds, which is probably as good as they've done in a very long time. Just scanning through here, perhaps their best ever, in fact. So, credit there. But, a lot of the back half of the draft is where they kind of, I don't want to say padded the stats, but you see some of these veterans that have been around a professional style of program. And that's where it gets into that. Like maybe this is just an easier transition from Michigan to the NFL for some of these guys. Cornelius Johnson, been around for a long time. Ladarius Henderson, been around for a long time. Michael Barrett, another guy who has been around for a long time at Michigan as 7th rounders. And you figure maybe they just make an easier transition. But yeah, far short of the 18 invited to the combine, far short of the 20 number that was thrown out by Jim Harbaugh, but still more than any other school in the nation this past year. So we'll see how they kind of fix and replace those guys that they lost.
And that's going to be the challenge this year for them, because Ohio State they lost the 4 guys who were drafted, and they got back virtually all of their upperclassmen. Marvin Harrison and Michael Hall were the only 2 underclassmen to declare for Ohio State. And for Michigan, you kind of had the going out on a high note thing, leaving after the national championship. Virtually everyone who could leave left. And then you also had Rod Moore, who I believe could have left and chose to come back and then suffered a pretty significant injury. So they're going to be without him potentially this year as well. It feels like there's a lot of holes to fill on that Michigan roster. And when you look at the recruiting the last couple of years and you look at the, not real active in the transfer portal this season, it feels like, they have done a very good job developing the players that they've had. And that's why you've got 13 guys getting drafted. But it feels like, boy, there are a lot of questions still on that roster, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Defense feels like they're in pretty decent shape. The Rod Moore injury is a big one, but it feels like there's a lot of questions on that offensive side of the ball, and I don't know how many answers they really feel like they have coming out of spring.
Yeah, and a lot of that development was done by coaches that are no longer at Michigan. So you Michigan fans and Michigan people can think that, well, we'll just continue to develop, and there will be some of that to some extent, but can you expect to continue to develop at the same rate that you have been when the coaching staff is much different than it was and the strength staff is looking different as well? But also some of these guys, you've got some transfers that came in and were helpful and were kind of more finished product, AJ Barner, Ladarius Henderson, who helped out as well. Like some of these guys that come in from outside that don't necessarily need to be developed as much, that helps supplement that helps correct some mistakes. And both Ohio State and Michigan have done that and done it pretty well in terms of going to the portal and finding guys. But I don't know, replacing the entire offensive line with 6 of your top 7 of your top 8, something like that. I think, as we mentioned before, it's a good sign that they were able to field 2 offensive lines in the spring game. That's promising. We'll see what goes from there. But as we know, like the spring game is never going to be your best offensive line because it's kind of a mix and a match thing. They've got some young talent at receiver. The question is quarterback, of course, and what do they have behind Donovan Edwards? And really, what is Donovan Edwards when if you can't just expect a 50-yard run, 2 50-yard runs, and that'll be enough for him. He's got to become more consistent. And can you become more consistent with a questionable offensive line? But I do think he'll be helped by having a quarterback like Alex Orji who can run and can keep defenses from focusing on the running back. Defensively, I know they feel very confident about their defensive line. They still return some defensive ends who have played a ton for them. And of course, you've got the 2 defensive tackles that everybody loves, and Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham. Linebackers, they got a good transfer in from Maryland, and the transfer that they got the year before from Nebraska should be 2 of the best in the Big Ten. The secondary is a question mark. They lose a guy to the portal who is battling for a starting cornerback spot, but they might be getting somebody back from the portal battling for a starting cornerback spot. But good luck replacing Rod Moore. That one hurts. And Keon Sabb is already gone. So there are some question marks, and the lackluster-ish kind of recruiting is going to have to fill those spots because I don't know how much more is going to be happening in the portal, honestly.
Well, we are getting close to the end of the spring transfer portal season. That portal closes on Tuesday night. A couple more days for players to potentially enter. Not as many guys in there, I think, broadly speaking, across the nation, as you might have expected this time of year. So that does not mean you have to be signed with your new school by Tuesday. It just means if you want to enter, you've got to enter by Tuesday. So we'll have a more complete look at where things stand in the portal coming up in just a couple days. But before then, we've got plenty more to talk about at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We hope you can join Tony and Kevin and I there, along with Mark and Ross and our whole team of X's Nose gurus, making you a smarter football fan. We talked about the special we're running on the show last Friday. I'm not going to rehash that whole thing, but we have significantly slashed the price of an annual subscription right now for just the next couple weeks. Overthought. I wonder what it's like. Wonder why people find value in that. Well, it's a great time to figure it out. You can sign up today at BuckeyeHuddle.com. You want to just try it for a month, see if you like it, and then sign up, then add on that annual subscription. You can do that as well, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Also, make sure you check us out at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. We're going to have plenty of stuff to talk about there as well, about Ohio State, about Michigan, about all sorts of interesting and exciting stuff happening in 2024, year when everything is changing all at once about college football. Should be a fascinating season. We hope to see you there. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.